All right, so we've got this really interesting collection of sources you've sent over. A history podcast, some excerpts from Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code,
Mm.
and even a scholarly quote about Gallo-Roman society.
Yeah.
All about the Franks.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing how their name echoes through history.
hmm
It even pops up in languages across Asia. Have you ever heard of the word farang?
Yeah, that's a great example of how influential the Franks were. The term farang is used in Thai and some other languages to refer to Westerners.
Right.
It's like their name became a synonym for the West itself.
Mm.
Even the word for guava in Thai farang goes back to the Portuguese who brought the fruit over and were, in that context, considered Frankish.
Wow, that's fascinating how these linguistic connections stretch across time and continents.
Yeah.
But for those of us who need a little bit of a refresher, who exactly were these Franks?
Well, our deep dive will take us back to 4th century AD Gaul. So picture the Roman Empire, already feeling the strain of its vast borders, facing increasing pressure from migrating Germanic peoples. The Franks kind of emerge onto the historical stage during this really chaotic time.
And their first appearance in Roman records wasn't exactly as mighty conquerors, right?
Not really.
More like a nuisance?
Exactly. In 357 AD, while the Roman Emperor Julian was, busy fending off the formidable Alemanni, a group of Franks saw an opportunity and launched raids along the Meuse Valley. They weren't a huge threat at this point, but they made their presence known.
And I bet they definitely had a look that would turn heads.
Oh, yeah.
I was reading that a Roman poet described them with shaved heads, except for a top knot of red hair, long combed mustaches, revealing clothing.
Wow.
Quite the image.
That visual is super important. Their appearance was meant to be intimidating, playing into that whole perception of barbarians on the edges of the Roman world.
Right.
But here's the irony. The name Franks actually means free ones.
Oh, okay.
Yet at this point, they were very much in the orbit of Roman power, even subservient in a lot of ways.
Okay, so let's unpack that contradiction a little bit. So if they were called free ones, how did this relationship with Rome actually work? Were they enemies or were they allies?
It was a complicated dynamic. The Romans, they were facing a manpower shortage in their army.
Okay.
And they often recruited from Germanic groups, along their borders. These allied groups were called foederati. Essentially, they were contracted warriors who provided military service in exchange for land or payments.
Okay.
The Franks were among these groups, providing much needed muscle for the Roman war machine.
So the Franks were more like hired hands than outright enemies.
Yeah, precisely. And this whole arrangement benefited both sides.
Mm.
The Romans, they got their soldiers, and the Franks gained access to the riches and the relative stability of Roman civilization. We even see examples of Franks rising through the ranks, becoming Roman generals, and proudly proclaiming their dual allegiance. You have to imagine that this constant influx of Germanic warriors must have had a significant impact on the Roman Empire itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Wasn't it already going through this period of militarization?
Exactly. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman army was increasingly made up of soldiers of Germanic origin. Historians often call this the barbarianization of the Roman army.
Okay.
And it was a process that had really profound implications, especially in the frontier regions like Gaul.
So as Roman institutions started to weaken, did these warrior groups, like the Franks included, start to see an opportunity to kind of seize power for themselves?
You're exactly right. The crumbling of traditional Roman structures, it empowered those with military strength. And while the Franks, they might have been considered less prestigious than groups like the Goths or the Alemanni at this time, their strategic position during the Roman collapse would prove to be super crucial.
So it sounds like the stage is set for some serious power struggles, almost like a real-life Game of Thrones brewing in ancient Gaul. But before we dive into the rise of the Frankish kings, our sources introduce this really interesting character, St. Martin of Tours.
Ah, yes, St. Martin. His story, reflects a different kind of power that was emerging during this time, religious authority.
Right.
He was a Roman soldier stationed in Gaul who had this, profound spiritual awakening and eventually renounced his military career to become a monk.
His story is really compelling. So,
Yeah.
Picture Gaul in the depths of winter.
Okay.
A freezing beggar pleads for help, and Martin, without any hesitation, cuts his own cloak in half to share it with the beggar.
Yeah.
Later, he has a vision of Christ wearing that very piece of cloth.
Wow, talk about a sign.
Right.
Yeah.
That act of compassion really cemented his commitment to a life of poverty and service to God, right?
Yeah.
And his fame just spread as he performed miracles, healed the sick, and attracted followers from all walks of life.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really important here is that he actively rejected the worldly trappings of power that a lot of people within the church favored. So this made him like a really potent symbol of a different kind of leadership, one rooted in humility and spiritual devotion.
Exactly.
So on the one hand, you have this Roman elite clinging to their, fading power. On the other hand, you have these figures like St. Martin embodying this new, more spiritual form of authority.
Mm.
So did this new wave of faith impact the Franks? Did they take notice?
That's a really good question. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because as Roman authority continued to crumble, a new type of leader rose to prominence, the Frankish warlord. And one of the most ambitious and frankly ruthless of these Frankish warlords was Clovis. He wasn't content with just being another chieftain. He had his sights set on becoming a king.
So he saw the crumbling Roman Empire not as, a disaster, but as an opportunity.
Exactly. Clovis really strategically targeted his rivals, and his first major victory came against this figure who, really represents this transition from Roman to Frankish power, Syagrius. Syagrius was a Roman general who was holding on to some territory in northern Gaul, and he even called himself the king of the Romans.
So defeating him, it wasn't just about territory, it was about making a statement.
Precisely. Their clash at Soissons in 486 AD, that was like a turning point. It really signaled the end of Roman rule in that region and the rise of Frankish dominance. And Clovis, he didn't stop there. He went on to conquer other Germanic tribes, the Alemanni, the Burgundians. He was really solidifying his control over what had once been Roman Gaul.
And this is where we encounter the famous Merovingian dynasty, right?
Yes.
That name, it always makes me think of like mystery and legend.
It does, doesn't it? The dynasty's name comes from Merovich, a figure who's shrouded in myth and speculation. Some Frankish chronicles even claim that he was descended from a fantastical sea creature like part bull, part human, part sea monster.
Wow, that's an incredible origin story. Do you think there's any truth to that? Or is it pure fabrication?
It's probably more myth than reality, but these stories, they highlight how the Franks were establishing their own narratives of power, distinct from the Roman past. Claiming descent from, these fantastical beings, it added legitimacy to their rule in a world where that old order had, collapsed. Clovis, by establishing this dynasty, was solidifying his place in this new world.
So he's consolidating power through conquest. He's crafting this compelling origin story for his dynasty.
Mm-hmm.
But Clovis was also smart enough to realize that military might, it wasn't enough. He needed something else to really cement his authority, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And that something else was a strategic conversion to Christianity. Now, many Germanic kings at that time had embraced Arianism.
Right.
It was a branch of Christianity considered heretical by the Roman Church. But Clovis, he saw an opportunity to align himself with the dominant form of Christianity in the West.
So instead of siding with the outsiders of the Christian world, he went for the mainstream.
Exactly. He wanted to be on the winning team. And the story of his conversion, as told by the historian Gregory of Tours, it's pretty dramatic. Clovis, facing a fierce battle against the Alemanni at Tolbiac, supposedly cried out to the Christian god for help, vowing to convert if granted victory. And wouldn't you know it, he emerged victorious.
Quite a convenient turn of events. Do we think he was a true believer, or was this just like a calculated political move?
It's impossible to know for sure what was, going on in Clovis's mind, but his baptism by Bishop Remigius in Reims, a city that would later become the traditional site of French coronations, that was a huge event. It signaled his alliance with the Roman Church and earned him the support of the very influential Gallo-Roman aristocracy.
So he's playing a pretty clever game here, appealing to both the Franks and the Gallo-Romans by blending these elements of Christianity and traditional Frankish power.
Absolutely. He was a master at weaving together those Roman, Christian, and Frankish elements to forge this new kind of power. Picture this. Clovis, a barbarian king decked out in the purple robes of a Roman consul, scattering coins to the crowds after visiting the shrine of St. Martin in Tours.
Wow, that image really encapsulates his ambition and his understanding of symbolism. But why St. Martin?
Yeah.
Why not align himself with, a more prominent figure in the church hierarchy.
That's where Clovis's cunning really comes through. Remember, St. Martin was known for his humility, his generosity, his, rejection of wealth and worldly power. By, associating himself with St. Martin, Clovis tapped into this source of authority that really resonated with the common people.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive. You'd think a king trying to consolidate power would want to, rub elbows with the most powerful bishops, not a humble monk.
Right, but think about it, By embracing a figure like St. Martin, Clovis was differentiating himself from that established Gallo-Roman elite. He was presenting himself as, a pious kin, favored by God and in tune with the people. It was a brilliant strategy that allowed him to bypass those old power structures.
It's almost like he's creating, a new kind of celebrity by, attaching himself to St. Martin's legacy.
That's a great way to put it. And let's not forget the ruthlessness that went along with this really calculated image building. According to Gregory of Tours, Clovis lamented the lack of relatives left to help him, not out of any familial affection, but because he wanted to eliminate any potential rivals to his throne.
So he was a complex figure, to say the least, right? A shrewd strategist, a ruthless power player, and a master of, manipulating both religious and political symbolism.
Exactly. By the time he died in 511 AD, Clovis had united most of Gaul under his rule, establishing the most powerful kingdom in former Roman territory. And the Merovingian dynasty, with its blend of Roman and Frankish traditions, was really poised to, shape the future of Europe.
But was he truly replacing Roman authority? Or was he, in a sense, inheriting it and adapting it to fit this new reality?
Oh.
On our sources raise that really interesting question.
Yeah, it is a question worth pondering, and it's not the only intriguing thought our sources offer.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code kind of throws a real curveball into the mix by suggesting that the Merovingian dynasty was actually descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
Hold on, are we talking about, the holy bloodline theory?
Yes.
That's a pretty wild claim.
Yeah.
Is there any historical basis for that?
Yeah. It's a fascinating idea, and it's definitely captured the imagination of a lot of people. But it's important to remember that this theory is based on a very, loose interpretation of Frankish chronicles and early Christian symbolism. Most historians view it as highly unlikely, to say the least.
So maybe we should take that one with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Or maybe even a whole shaker full.
Exactly. But the fact that, that theory exists at all, it speaks to the enduring power of myths and legends. They can really capture our imaginations and make us question even the most, established narratives.
Speaking of, captivating stories, I'm ready to hear more about Clovis's successors.
All right.
Those Merovingian kings, they weren't exactly known for their, peaceful family gatherings, were they?
You're right about that. We're talking about a dynasty that was full of power struggles, bitter rivalries, and some truly remarkable women who weren't afraid to wield power. And at the center of it all, that cloak that St. Martin so famously cut in two.
Wait, the one he shared with the beggar?
Yes.
What role did that play in all of this?
That very cloak became this treasured relic, a symbol of Frankish kingship and divine right. It was even carried into battle as a talisman.
It's amazing how that simple act of charity by St. Martin became so interwoven with the destiny of the Frankish kingdom.
It really is. And that blending of Roman, Christian, and barbarian elements, it continued under the Merovingians. They adopted Roman titles. They continued to patronize the church. But they also held on to their, distinct Frankish identity.
Okay, you mentioned remarkable women.
Yes.
Tell me more about them. They weren't just sitting on the sidelines while the men fought for power, were they?
Not at all. Our next deep dive will explore the lives of Brunhilde and Fredegund, two queens who commanded armies, forged alliances, and whose rivalry really shook the Frankish world to its core. We're talking political intrigue, betrayals, revenge. Some historians even suggest brazen was involved. It's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
That simple garment, once a symbol of St. Martin's compassion, became a prized possession of the Frankish kings. Almost like this sacred banner that gave them the right to rule,
You mentioned they carried it into battle.
They did. Imagine the scene warriors in their chainmail, swords, glinting in the sun, and there at the front, this simple cloak flapping in the wind, like a tangible link to St. Martin.
Wow.
A symbol of, divine favor.
That's such a powerful visual.
Yeah.
It must have had a huge psychological impact on both the Franks and, their enemies.
Oh, absolutely. It was this potent reminder of the connection between earthly power and, divine authority.
Yeah.
And this fusion of Roman, Christian, and Frankish elements is like a recurring theme throughout the whole Merovingian period.
Let's not forget about those Frankish queens we were talking about, Brunhilde and Fredegund.
Right.
What were their stories? They weren't just passive players in this, like, male-dominated world, were they?
No, not at all. They were forces to be reckoned with. Brunhilde, she was a Visigothic princess who married Sigebert, one of Clovis's grandsons. She was known for her intelligence, her political skills, and her ambition. Let me tell you.
She sounds like a formidable woman. What about Fredegund?
Fredegund, she was a woman who, rose from really humble beginnings to become the queen of Chilperic, another one of Clovis's grandsons.
Oh.
And she was known for her ruthlessness and her cunning. And her rivalry with Brunhilde, legendary. Think, political maneuvering, betrayals, assassinations. It was a real struggle for power that went on for decades and had a huge impact on the Frankish kingdom.
Wow. It sounds almost Shakespearean, these two powerful women locked in this bitter feud with, like, the fate of a kingdom hanging in the balance.
It's a really captivating story, and it really shows how even in a society, dominated by men, women could have real influence and power. They weren't just queens sitting in their castles. They were active players shaping events and, leaving their mark on history.
So their stories give us a glimpse into, like, a different side of Frankish society.
Yeah.
One where women could really rise to positions of power and influence.
Exactly. It reminds us that history is never just like a simple one-dimensional story, right?
Yeah.
It's full of, complex characters, both men and women, who defy simple categories.
It sounds like we've only just, like, scratched the surface of the Frankish world.
Yeah.
From, those early encounters with the Romans to the rise of this powerful dynasty, from the influence of people like St. Martin to all the intrigues of the Merovingian court.
Mm-hmm.
Story full of twists and turns.
It is, and it's a story that, continues to fascinate us today. It gives us a window into, like, a pivotal period in European history, a time of transition, transformation, and the emergence of new powers that would, ultimately shape the world we live in.
Very well said. And for our listeners who want to delve a little deeper into this fascinating period, I highly recommend checking out the sources that inspired this deep dive. You'll find links to them in our show notes. And if you enjoyed this journey back in time, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Until then, keep exploring the endlessly fascinating world of history